So the War of 1812 is over. One of the big results, the demise of the Federalist Party, is essentially going to mean that there's a perception of one-party rule, the Republicans. So that's why this has been nicknamed the Era of Good Feelings. Now, overall, our success, or if you want to get technical, our lack of loss in the War of 1812 gave Americans an increased sense of national pride. Most Americans in the mid-1810s, war ends in 1815, most Americans at this time still identify by the state they live in. And the nation is still referred to as these, plural, these United States, rather than the United States. But a new identity is starting to emerge. Now, these three things that you see on screen are the goals of congressional Republicans at the end of Madison's presidency and essentially the entirety of the 2 terms of James Monroe, which is the president that comes next. Now there's this phrase, triumvirate. Triumvirate translates to rule of 3. Rule of 3. It comes from the Roman Empire. Well, technically it was used near the end of the Roman Republic as they transitioned into the empire, so it's identified with Rome. The 3 members of the triumvirate are Henry Clay of Kentucky, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, 2 men we've seen before, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. The 3 of them served together in Congress, and their goals and eventual divisions amongst each other are going to shape U.S. policy and society for about the next 3.5 decades, even leading up to the U.S. Civil War. The numbered tasks that you see here: new national bank, improve infrastructure, protect U.S. manufacturers. These are all proposed as part of Henry Clay's so-called American system. Now, eventually, passions and divisions over aspects of this program will lead to a fracturing of the Republican Party, because part of this also includes expanding the role of the federal government within the borders of the United States and also stepping out onto the world stage. So what we're going to do is take a little bit closer look at two of these goals of the American system. The first is a new national bank, which you're probably thinking, second bank, what about the first bank? Now, the first bank was signed into law by President Washington 20 years ago, 1791. The charter was for 20 years. Well, guess what? It's up for renewal in 1811. Republicans control the presidency and the Congress, and nobody's surprised when they veto the extension of it. Enter the war. Enter the war. It causes intense financial difficulties. We had never experienced it as a nation. Now, Treasury accounts are often held by state banks who handled the crisis poorly, since there aren't any national banks to take care of the finances. Now, at this time, because we see prices and interest rates rise, the debt was $45 million, and this is where it stood at the end of the war, 127. At the time, banks only printed enough money that was backed up by the gold and silver in their vaults. Now, the war throws this into a tailspin. So many private banks printed more money than was backed up, and this leads to something called inflation. So the financial struggles that we had led to the idea of revisiting the bank. Now, this is a complete role reversal for Henry Clay, who had staunchly opposed the bank years earlier. Now, he gets around it. He's very good at making an argument. Henry Clay argued that his veto was justified in 1811. And even though the Constitution was unchanged, remember, the Constitution doesn't mention a bank. That's what Madison and Jefferson had said all those years ago. Even though the Constitution was unchanged, our circumstances had changed. He believed that we could not survive another war with our finances in the shape that they were. And federal paper currency, federal bank notes, are more reliable than those of the state banks. Now, he felt that having a secure national bank was necessary to promote the general welfare, which is in the Constitution. Daniel Webster sided with Henry Clay on this. So the second member of the triumvirate, Daniel Webster, representing Massachusetts, sided with Clay. And he even sided with him on most of the American system because he had been a Federalist. All right, he needed a new party. And he agrees with this idea of increasing federal powers. So step one, Bank of the United States. It is a success for now. It'll be challenged in court, but it is a success for now. So that's part one of the American system. Step two, improve infrastructure. Infrastructure means transportation. It's basically how a nation conducts business. So think bridges, building and maintaining roads, canals. The second part of Clay's American system involved paying for internal improvements. It's all about transportation. There are many Republicans, so there are many members of Clay's party who are skeptical of the plan because they opposed funding internal improvements for fiscal and constitutional reasons, meaning they think it'll be too expensive, and we can see here, most Republicans strictly interpret the Constitution. They strictly interpret it. The so-called Cumberland Road, and you can see here, Cumberland. It had been built from the Potomac River to the Ohio River. And this was known as the National Road. This road, and you can see the key down here, the National Road was the only such road that was built using federal funds. The only federally funded transportation project. The rest were built using a combination of private businesses and state and local government money. Now, Clay tried to argue that the Constitution stated, Congress shall have power to establish post offices and post roads. It allowed for post roads. So if these roads were built and maintained, nothing could stop people from using them for other purposes. Since this was the only federally funded project, that's why we can consider this part maybe a failure. The idea of building roads with congressional funds is a failure because this was the only one. So that's the road part of internal improvements. Next up we have canals. Canals, meaning you can travel in between different rivers. During this time frame, 4,000 miles of canals were constructed, costing $200 million. None of them were built with federal money. 0 with federal funds. The most famous one is the one you see up here. The Erie Canal, known as Clinton's Big Ditch. And it was named after New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, who oversaw its completion. Now, a series of locks and dams controlled water levels, because we can see here, you have Lake Erie all the way to the Hudson River, and all of these rivers and lakes in between. With different water levels, you need different locks to control it, to account for those differences. And collecting tolls at the locks actually allowed for construction costs to be paid off in only 9 years. So that's a pretty good track record. Now you can see the numbers here, 40 feet wide, and all of that. $7 million paid off in 9 years. these are some of the more important lasting effects. Farmers used to have to send their goods down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers for New Orleans. They'd have to go through New Orleans even if their goods were going to the East Coast, because the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, the Allegheny Mountains, stood in the way. That's no longer the case. Now they can directly travel east. New York is going to surpass New Orleans. So New York City rises. New York City will surpass New Orleans as the nation's busiest port. And it's going to surpass Philadelphia as the financial center of the country. It remains that way to this day. When you hear people talking about Wall Street, big money, Wall Street, it's in New York City. It rises at this point. And now it's even a global financial center. New York will become the new gateway to the West. It was Philadelphia. Now it shifts to New York, because once you go from Lake Erie, starting in Buffalo, all the way to the Hudson River, that connects to New York City. Now, shipping costs were 1/10 of what they were over land. So goods like wheat and corn and pigs and lumber are going to flow from the interior of the country. That's another thing about the Erie Canal. The vast majority of goods will travel from west to east. So the wealth and the feeding of the people in the east will come due to Western labor and at Western expense. Now, to commemorate the opening of the canal in 1825, they actually had an artillery salute planned from Buffalo to New York. And what that means is when the first ship left Lake Erie to enter Buffalo, a cannon was fired. When the next port in the east heard about it, they fired their own cannon, and so on. Once the cannon fire reached Albany, the salute turned south to New York City to symbolize the linking of Lake Erie with the Atlantic Ocean. Once it reached New York, it turned around and made it all the way back to Buffalo. The series of exchange took 82 minutes, so a little less than an hour and a half for the cannon fire to go from Buffalo to New York City and back to Buffalo. It was the quickest exchange up to that point in history. The building of the canal, this idea of man being in control of nature, it starts to give Americans this perception that we are in control of our destiny. We can do whatever we want as long as we have the manpower and we have the will to make it happen. So the first two parts of the American system, the Bank of the United States was a success. Using federal money to fund internal improvements was a failure because it was only the national road that was built. But that doesn't mean that states, local government, and private business didn't pitch in to make it happen.